Dr. Mark Harris. Mark has pioneered and leads the first ever master's program in science and religion at the university in the UK at the University of Edinburgh. You were head of Oxford on that, I believe. They've only just got theirs going. And his background is in physics. He worked as a research physicist and then trained in theology, and now, as I say, heads up this Science and Religion Masters.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be the first speaker in such a course as this, because not only do I get to speak before you've had a chance to form your own opinions, which means that perhaps you don't have so many yardsticks to judge me by, it also means I get to give you my opinion on this extremely contentious issue of what is science and religion. Now, Hilary did actually give me this title, so it's not what I would have chosen, but I mean, I think that's actually quite a good thing. I've always found that when I've been given a title, I always wrestle with it to some degree and think, oh, why was I given this? But actually, I sort of find myself wrestling with it and actually coming to live with it in quite a helpful way, personally. And I think it's got something out of me that I wouldn't otherwise have done. So, Clash of Worldviews ? I'm sure that all of you here will be aware that it's impossible to kind of talk about science and religion without having this question mark here. And yet, if you were to go out onto the streets of Cambridge and ask a selection of shoppers passing by, what do you think about science and religion? The majority opinion that you would get would probably express some kind of sense of conflict, or that all is not right between them. Well, I will argue in my next 45 minutes or so that despite what many people in our cultures believe, it is not a foregone conclusion that science and religion should be at war with each other. There are many other ways of looking at the problem, and I'll in fact suggest that the view that science and religion should always clash with each other is in fact a worldview of its own. I want to say a bit about myself first of all. Hilary's already given me a bit of an introduction. It's always the case. You prepare these lovely slides on your computer and it never quite looks right on the screen. I often like to introduce myself by showing pictures of my two favourite workplaces that I've been at down the years. I'm a scientist, a condensed matter physicist who has fallen into biblical studies, like you do. This shows my current workplace. This is the School of Divinity, the Theology Department in the University of Edinburgh, right next to the castle. It is surely one of, if not the most beautiful theology departments in the whole world. It's a wonderful place to work. This is where I spent many, many hours and years of my life. This is from the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory near Oxford, where for quite a long time I was one of the staff scientists working on a series of experiments using neutron scattering, trying to understand the magnetic properties of materials at the sort of most fundamental level. And I use these pictures because I think just visually, if you can see them that is, they express something quite important about myself as a religious person who is also a scientist, managing to kind of encapsulate that in one person. On the left here, we have what's called the ISIS facility, slightly unfortunate name in this day and age, but anyway, it's called the ISIS facility. We had the name first. If you could see the picture, there's a whole series of beam lines looking into this, it's called the target station here, looking at beams of neutrons and muons coming off it. And I think that expresses very nicely, at least my area of science. We spend all of our time trying to focus in on nature at the most finest, deepest level, compared with my life as a theologian. More of the time nowadays, the Twin Towers of New College express perfectly the kind of transcendence, looking up to the heavens, trying to see the glories of nature and particularly hoping that we might see the divine revealed in them. So those two pictures, I think, express in a way two worldviews which I somehow manage, I hope, to encompass within myself. Now, just to give you a quick summary of what I'm going to say, first of all, I'll say a little bit about worldview. Secondly, to ask that it turns out to be a really difficult question. What is religion? We all know what it means, but if you try to define it, it's actually quite a challenge, as is the question, what is science? I'll then go on to talk about this combined thing, this kind of amalgam, science and religion. I'm going to offer you 6 different models for this amalgam, science and religion. It might sound rather complex. My apologies. That's the way it is. But hopefully, by the end of this, you'll have got some sense through this. So, first of all, worldview. What is that? Oh, no, sorry, I was going to say something else first. One way to look through science and religion, or to look into it, is to ask what some of the great thinkers of our times have said about it, and you learn quite a lot from them. So, the first quote I've chosen is from Bertrand Russell from approximately a century ago. He said, "Religion is something left over from the infancy of our intelligence. It will fade away as we adopt reason and science as our guidelines." So that was about 100 years ago. Straight away, that tells you something that is a kind of pervading myth, I would call it, or a kind of a theme, anyway, in the kind of secularization idea that religion is part of our primitive history, that science and reason is slowly replacing it. Of course, that was about 100 years ago. I wouldn't have said there's much of a sign that religion is on the way out, but nevertheless, that's what Bertrand Russell said. Someone a little bit more recently, he's always good for a quote on science and religion. Albert Einstein is famous for having said, among other things, "Science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind." Expressing something of the need for each other, also complementarity, which you often hear expressed by those who are more friendly towards religion. More recently still, Martin Luther King, "Science investigates, religion interprets. Science gives man," please excuse the exclusive language there, "Science gives man knowledge, which is power. Religion gives man wisdom, which is control." So again, a kind of a sense in which they are different things, but they mesh together in some way. They are complementary. But importantly, power and control, they are value systems as well, whatever else we may think about them, which means they come with a kind of a health warning, if you like. You have to treat them with respect. They are not value-free. And finally, this is from Jocelyn Bell Burnell, the famous astronomer who discovered pulsars. She's a Quaker, a particular denomination in Christianity. And she says, "I find that Quakerism and research science fit together very, very well. In Quakerism, you're expected to develop your own understanding of God from your experience in the world. There isn't a creed, there isn't a dogma." So she is someone who managed to fit together her scientific and her religious kind of sensibilities within herself extremely well. But notice the implication that it's because she's a Quaker, which doesn't have such a fixed set of definitions, doctrines, as many other religious expressions. So which might immediately kind of make you think, it's not straightforward. It depends on which expressions of religion you're talking about. Worldview. Let's talk about that because that's in my title. If you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find this very simple definition. A worldview is a particular philosophy of life or conception of the world. Well, clearly both science and religion can be seen to be worldviews according to this definition. So science offers you a conception of the world. Religion offers you a particular or series of philosophies of life, so they can both be seen to be worldviews. Now, the question that arises here for me is, can you hold two worldviews simultaneously? I would think not, actually, because a worldview ought to be all-encompassing. But I'm not sure it's as simple as all of this, because my personal belief is that each of us has a worldview, which is probably different in small respects, some major respects, across individuals, and that's informed in different ways by science and religion, as well as many other things like social, political, cultural factors, values in short. And somehow science and religion fit together, or maybe don't fit together, in my worldview. So I prefer not to speak of two worldviews, rather as one worldview in which science and religion offer kind of shifting perspectives within it. Now, just to try to explain that a little bit, I've got a quote here, which I've pondered long and hard on, having seen it first of all. It's by the Muslim scholar Hussein Nasser in the Oxford Handbook of Religion and Science, so a very a good authority, and he's writing about the subject of Islam and science. And this is what he says. Many of the champions of the blind emulation of modern science and technology claim that it is value-free. And of course, we often assume that in the Western world, that science is completely value-free. It just is. It describes the way of the world. Get over it. There are no values associated with it. What he says, though, is that modern science, like any other science, is based on a particular value system and a specific worldview. Even a 747 Boeing jet is not global simply because it's now landing in Samoa as well as Tokyo, Beijing, as well as Islamabad or Tehran. Rather, it's the result of a technology derived from a particular view of the world, a view which many forces in the modern or even postmodern West are trying to globalize by eliminating other views of the world of nature and man's relationship to it, including, of course, the Islamic one. A little bit dense, that quote, but I think it captures this whole point about worldview very nicely, particularly with the idea of a jumbo jet coming into land at various airports across the world. Of course, the laws of physics are the same across the world, aren't they? The jumbo jet works. The point is, he's trying to say, is that this jumbo jet carries cultural baggage with it, which you might forget about if you're from the West, or may not even notice, but there are other cultures and other religious systems for which this carries a message, an implicit message to do with science and the human relationship with the natural world. So with that in mind, let me move on to ask about what is religion. Well, historically, the idea of religion as a discrete thing in itself, particularly different religions as discrete things in themselves, really only came into existence around the 19th century time, which is also, not coincidentally, around the time that science came to be recognized as a thing in itself. They're clearly rather closely linked as concepts, at least in their historical genesis. Now, religion is notoriously difficult to define because if, for instance, you define it as belief in a god, for instance, well, straight away you've got other religions that believe in more than one god, and you've got other religions still which do not attest to belief in a god in the same way. So you have to keep away from the supernatural and find another way of doing it. This is a very famous definition by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz. He tries to set religion up as a series of symbols, and this is what he says. A religion is one, a system of symbols which acts to two, establish powerful, pervasive and long-lasting moods and motivations in men, apologies for the language again, by three, formulating conceptions of a general order of existence, and four, clothing these conceptions with such an aura of facticity that five, the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. I won't go into that in depth, but notice that this definition works almost as well for science. It's a very abstract definition, focuses on the cognitive role of symbols, and I would be surprised if anyone here who's a religious believer feels comfortable with this. I mean, of course, it captures an awful lot of mindsets, worldviews, and belief systems, but does that really capture religion? Well, it certainly doesn't capture mine anyway. The kinds of things I would want to emphasize instead or in addition would be things like encounter, experience of the other as well as with each other in community, religion's attempts to deal with the hard facts of life, such as suffering and death, for instance. Many religions have definitive answers for these. And also religion in a kind of prophetic dimension, a refusal to accept that the way of the world that we see is the way it should be. All of those are things that I would also want to put in this, but of course the tendency to make it more specific destroys the generality, and before you know it, you don't have a definition of religion, you've got a definition of my religion. So this is the paradox of trying to explain or define religion. Everyone knows what it is, but it's enormously difficult to try to put it down in words such that it would match everyone's worldview. So I suspect that this definition captures almost no one's understanding of religion in any meaningful way. And so we instantly would want to put more specifics onto it. Well, the same thing happens to be true of science, strangely, if you try and define what science is. It's almost impossible to define in general terms, and yet we speak about science. We know what it means to talk about science as a general thing, we think. Is it a set of topics that are all joined up together? Well, perhaps. Is it a method? Is it a form of knowledge about the world? Well, perhaps. What I've done here is to just throw down on the screen as many different sciences, with as many different methodologies as I could think of off the top of my head. Physical science, life science, atmospheric science, space, materials, engineering, human, medical, social, food, sports science. All of these things claim to be sciences, but they have many different aims, objectives, and methodologies for doing that. Now, of course, you could say to me, well, hang on a moment. They're all joined by their commitment to observation, testing, and constructing explanations. Well, sure they are, but then so are many other disciplines, like history or even theology, for instance. So what is it that makes these scientific and those not? So it's a very, very, very difficult question to answer. And this is one of the problems of the issue. If religion is hard to define and science is hard to define, well, how do we then talk about their worldviews or them clashing? It's one of the big problems of this particular issue. Take physics, my own science. Oh, unfortunately, that hasn't come out very well. That's a shame. On the left, you've got some galaxy clusters seen from the Hubble Space Telescope. 10 to the 16 meters, so 1 followed by 16 zeros, is the length scale on the left. At the other end of the length scale, this is like a screenshot from the Large Hadron Collider in CERN in Geneva, showing two protons colliding and all of the many things that come off, the products of the collision there. What is it that connects those two pictures? Notice there's a huge difference in length scale, 31 orders of magnitude there. Even one science, physics, does not know how to connect those two together in any meaningful way, except that we know that it's something to do with what happened in the first tiny fraction of a second in the Big Bang, which we can't describe very well theoretically. So even one science has problems trying to join up all of the possible areas of interest. And what connects these two areas of science? On the left, I've got particle physics. That's the Large Hadron Collider, looking right down inside it, and CERN from the air. There we've got a lovely Tyrannosaurus Rex and some paleontologists going about their business. What is it that connects these two areas of science in terms of subject, their objects, their aims, their method? And I would say there is no straightforward way to describe what they're doing, apart from the fact that it's the natural world. And again, that comes with a lot of baggage too, trying to explain it. I didn't choose particle physics and paleontology at random. Both of them are frequently cited as showing that science and religion are in conflict. So particle physics on the left, highly mathematical, very successful at demonstrating our ability to discern the deep principles of the world without needing to call upon God. Paleontology, on the other hand, of course, is part of the right at the heart of the picture of evolutionary biology, which brings issues about how science and religion relate. Can we compare the different laws of nature that they provide? Well, I'm not sure we can. And I think this is the beauty of the subject that I teach now, science and religion, the big amalgam, science and religion. Because it suggests that there are answers to what is religion, what is science, and how can we join them up, in spite of the fact that we can't do it theoretically. And here's a very popular one, popular in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This is the answer to what connects up these various sciences. It is this: it's nothing. Or in other words, creation from nothing. As I said, a very popular idea in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam to some degree too. The idea that everything that there is, in other words, the entire world, came from no thing. God, the creator, in other words. And that means that every science or every discipline which tries to understand the things has to start with the no thing, if you like. effectively the know thing is the unifying principle across all of the sciences. That would be a religious, or Christian, Jewish, Muslim perhaps, perspective on how to understand what all of the sciences are doing, and one that appeals to me anyway. You may have a completely different take on it, and I'd be very interested to hear about that in the questions, but that's mine anyway. If you adopt this particular perspective, then all of the sciences are connected as working towards the things that were made by the no thing, if you like. What are the implications of that idea? What are the implications of denying that idea? Well, they are many and varied, but by exploring the different ways that science and religion relate, you can try to make use of that and get beyond the idea further. But this idea of creation from nothing, I think it provides a perspective on the science which has a tendency to unite them. They can't unite themselves, the sciences can't unite themselves from within. Particle physics can't say, I can see exactly how evolutionary biology relates to me. I can see how chemistry and sports science, yes, I understand you all. You all fit within this particular framework. The sciences can't meaningfully do that themselves. I suggest that we need to go outside of the sciences in order to unify them. A perspective like this provides one possible way of doing it. Let's click through that. So actually, talking about science and religion as two monolithic entities coming together, perhaps battling with each other when they do, is not actually very helpful. And it's better to talk about them as one entity, or perhaps as a perspective on science or a perspective on religion. So we might talk about religious science, a theological perspective on science, one thing, one worldview, if you like, or perhaps scientific religion, rather than two, as I said, monolithic entities, which it's not clear that they are, excuse me, battling up against each other. But I'm getting ahead of myself in suggesting that science and religion can combine in some way. What I need to do, first of all, is to break this down very carefully by talking about what is science and religion, this amalgam. Thank you very much. Now, a very important figure in talking about science and religion is this man, Ian Barber, who died just a couple of years ago, sadly. He is often said to be the founder of science and religion as an academic enterprise. In other words, seeing it as a subject of inquiry in itself. And one of the things that he's particularly well known for are his 4 models of interaction between science, where he suggested that, and this is a kind of an evolutionary model. You start with number 1, conflict, and as you understand the issues and the different subjects and how they interact with each other more, you slowly work your way through the model. So conflict is at the beginning, independence, dialogue, finally integration. And I'll work through these. Starting off with the first model he suggested, conflict. So this is often referred to as the conflict hypothesis. This is the idea that science and religion are perpetually in competition with each other over the same territory, namely explanation for the way the world is. Religion may have held sway for much of human history, but science has steadily advanced into its territory over the modern period. So it goes alongside, the conflict hypothesis goes alongside a kind of triumphalist historical understanding. And of course, it often makes use of these rather militaristic metaphors as well. 2 books are very important in the 19th century for particularly starting this whole hypothesis off. Andrew Dixon White's A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, and John William Draper's History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. You can hear that there's sort of all these militaristic metaphors. In fact, I'll give you a quote from Draper here just to further underscore that. The antagonism we thus witness between religion and science is the continuation of a struggle that commenced when Christianity began to attain political power. The history of science is not a mere record of isolated discoveries. It's a narrative of the conflict of 2 contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on one side and the compression arising from traditionary faith and human interests on the other. You can see which side he was biased towards, can't you? So he sees it in terms of a battle, rather like 2 military powers. Now, very often today, if you go searching for quotations or books that are written about science and religion being at conflict, you will find them particularly coming from scientists, and particularly scientists who fall into the new atheist camp. People like Richard Dawkins, for instance, or Sam Harris. And here's a great quote from Jerry Coyne's new book called Faith versus Fact. He says, "The claim that religion and science are complementary ways of knowing gives unwarranted credibility to faith, a credibility that, at its extremes, is responsible for many human deaths and might ultimately contribute to the demise of our own species and much other life on Earth." So that's fairly extreme. I mean, it's not just that religion and science are in conflict with each other, but that science has to win this battle because the future of the human race depends on it. So a very aggressive take from the science angle, but you also get similar aggression from religious viewpoints too, particularly those coming from young earth creationism or fundamentalist perspectives. This is from Henry Morris, the young earth creationist, who says, "We have been living in an age of deep skepticism, a century of evolutionary philosophy with its seeds of naturalism and atheism has yielded the bitter fruits of violence, non-moralism and despair." In other words, evolution has brought many evils with it, many social evils, and by counteracting these, hopefully we can build a better society, is the gist. Now, it's very interesting, because the science and religion field, people like me who teach the science and religion field, feel instinctively, most of us, very uncomfortable with the conflict hypothesis, and will instinctively try to get away from it and tell you that there are other ways of looking at things. However, it must be said that there are examples of conflict. These quotes give you some idea of that. You can't just gloss over it all. But I think through having read quite a lot of the material, I've slowly become convinced that those who shout the loudest about conflict between science and religion are those who particularly have an agenda on this issue, particularly those who want to promote science over religion, such that religion disappears, or vice versa. So those who tend to promote the conflict hypothesis most strongly are those often who have quite an imperialistic agenda to gain from it. Now, very often the conflict hypothesis, those who support it often argue from various historical episodes as well in the history of science, particularly the trial of Galileo and the Darwin debates. I won't say any more about those because I think James is going to say something about them. I'll leave it up to him to give you his perspective. And I'll go on to the next model, number 2, which is called independence in Barber's typology. Now, this is quite a tricky one to tease out. What exactly is the content of the independence model? Well, the suggestion is that science and religion simply don't overlap with each other, both in the questions they ask and the kind of answers they come up with. And that in particular is often attributed to Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist, with his model, it's called NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. That science and religion are two magisteria, systems of authority, in other words, systems of doctrine, provide you with answers, which are they complement each other, or at least they don't overlap. Now, very interestingly, all of the new atheist writers always take Gould to task. He is the biggest enemy, if you like, far more than those who sort of argue aggressively for religion. It's because, of course, he effectively pulls the rug out from underneath the conflict hypothesis, which they need to work. So if you open Jerry Coyne's latest book, you'll see quite a long section attacking Stephen Jay Gould, as you will with Richard Dawkins as well. Anyway, so what does it mean to talk about independence or non-overlapping magisteria? One way of perhaps putting some content in this, and those of us who teach and work in the science and religion field often feel kind of drawn to complementarist perspectives. Does it mean that we can say that science and religion are complementary to each other? For instance, a quote here from the great German theologian Jürgen Moltmann, who described science and religion as different sides of the same reality, almost like different sides of the same coin. Or another thing that is quite often said by those who adopt this kind of perspective is that science asks the how questions and religion asks the why questions. Is that true? Well, I think you could probably give arguments for and against on that one. What I have heard a lot of Christians say, and I've been guilty of this myself many, many times, is saying there is no conflict between science and religion when asked about it. And I think the tacit assumption of many Christians, particularly in Western Europe, North America, is that there is no conflict. So this would be the kind of the tendency of those of us who want to build bridges to seek for peace would be to downplay the conflict and instead to emphasize the complementary nature of them, perhaps even to talk about concordance or even consonance. And I've got one important figure here is the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who's done quite a lot to try to emphasize the concordance of science and religion. This is a rather complex quote from his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies. It's a great read, actually. I really recommend this one as well. And this is his kind of thesis statement of the whole book. He says, "My overall claim in this book, there is superficial conflict but deep concord between science and theistic religion, but superficial concord and deep conflict between science and naturalism." And those of you who know Plantinga's work well will be aware that naturalism is the great kind of, his kind of bête noire, if you like, the thing that he thinks is most needs a correcting perspective on in the whole scientific worldview. So while science and theology can get along, although superficially they appear to be at conflict, it's the philosophical perspective of naturalism that most needs to be addressed. Let's go on to the third of Barber's models of interaction, dialogue. This is quite similar to the independence model in many ways. So this is based on the premise that science and religion ask related questions about the world. Perhaps they can even learn from each other once they learn how to speak to each other. And we might ask again, is this again another kind of way of saying that they're complementary to each other? Are they in some degree of concord? Well, thinking historically, it's incontrovertible that science and religion had a lot to say to each other, and I think James will probably have a lot to say about this too, until around the mid-19th century, and I will just say a tiny bit about this. You could point to things like, for instance, theology being described as the queen of the sciences in the Middle Ages, the idea that it has an underpinning or perhaps overseeing perspective on the other sciences, that metaphysics is more important than physics. And I mentioned the Christian doctrine of creation, the idea of creation from nothing, being a very kind of important foundational doctrine for early modern science in its early centuries, 16th, 17th centuries. The idea that God created the world as good, therefore what we reflect upon as scientists should reflect the nature of God as good. Since it was made from nothing, the world is contingent. There are no overarching principles that describe how it must have been. Rather, we have to go out there and discover for ourselves. And that act of discovery, observation, testing, hypothesizing, and so on, is in some way reflecting upon the mind of God, the divine lawgiver. That would be the kind of the mentality that would be behind this, which was, broadly speaking, undergirded much of modern science in the Western world until around the 19th century, which is why natural theology was such an important component of early modern science. And particularly this idea of laws of nature, which I'm particularly interested in as a physicist, which was laws of nature, the idea that nature might be regular and follow laws that were given to it by a divine lawgiver is a very, very ancient idea. You can go back to the Hebrew Bible and see the roots of the idea 2,000 to 3,000 years before the modern day. But the early modern scientists like Galileo, Descartes, Newton really latched onto it as a new way of effectively legitimating, justifying their approach of describing the world in terms of mathematics. And so you find that in the 17th century, there was an explosion of laws of nature, such as Descartes' laws of motion, Newton's laws, gravitation, Hooke's principle, and so on and so on and so on. So it became a very successful tool of modern science, early modern science, to talk in terms of laws of nature, all of which were underpinned by this idea of God as the divine lawgiver. Now, of course, Science has lost that theological basis for the laws of nature, but it still assumes laws, still assumes the intelligibility and regularity of the world. Peter Harrison, who's done a lot to investigate this particular idea and its roots in the history of science, makes quite a strong point. He says that even to speak of laws of nature today is still to make a tacitly theistic assumption about the nature of the universe. In other words, to speak about laws of nature is to make a religious statement, even if you don't realize you're doing it. And I wonder if that might not be one way of opening dialogue which doesn't really exist at the moment about the foundations and the philosophical and theological underpinnings of science. So that might be one possible way of opening forward some dialogue. The last of Barber's models, integration. This puts forward the idea that science and religion ultimately ask the same questions to the extent that they may be seen as effectively joining up, becoming something of the same discipline ultimately. And a great example of someone who has bought into this way of thinking is the Jesuit paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin, who in his very mystical book, Phenomenon of Man, put forward this view that all of evolution, all of evolving nature, is kind of straining towards the risen Christ as its end point. Omega point is the terminology he used, as the sort of perfection of evolution. So it's a kind of scientific process, evolution of course, but it is making a theological point effectively, pointing towards Christ. Another example of integration, a much more controversial one, could be intelligent design, where if you study the claims of intelligent design, it's quite hard to see where the science starts and where the theology stops. So that's another example of integration at work. But I'm going to go beyond Barber's fourfold typologies now and suggest that there are some other ways of looking at the way science and religion interact. First of all, calling up what's often called the complexity thesis from the historian John Hedley Brooke. He doesn't speak of this thesis himself. It's kind of been, his work has been labelled as complexity thesis. If you read his book, Science and Religion, Some Historical Perspectives, it's a very downplayed title, but it's an absolutely wonderful book. I really do recommend it. He in particular goes through one example after another in the history of science and religion and points out in particular that the conflict hypothesis is, well, true to some extent, but a very great simplification. Such a simplification in some cases that it doesn't really reflect the truth of what was going on. And this is a quote from his book on page 42. The fundamental weakness of the conflict hypothesis is its tendency to portray science and religion as hypostasized forces, as entities in themselves. They should rather be seen as complex social activities involving different expressions of human concern, the same individuals often participating in both. It's a very important observation he made, that often key thinkers in science, you can say, well, at that point Darwin was acting as a kind of conflict person, at that point he was an integrationist. I mean, in fact, Darwin is a good example, because you can see all four of Barber's models at various points in his life. So what Brooke does is to say, don't try to boil science and religion down to one particular model. There is a great deal of complexity here which reflects the social, political, economic, and sort of the values, basically, that these people were dealing with and living through. Now, one point in particular that I want to draw out from that is that if, like me, you are predisposed to avoid the conflict hypothesis, don't go and replace it with another model, because you'll only find that the same critique can apply to that one. And that actually is a downside to a lot of Christian apologetics in science and religion, that it tends to displace conflict by a harmonizing approach instead. But as John Hedley Brooke points out, that is vulnerable to the same kinds of critique as the conflict model. So I think it's safer to say, for the moment at least, let's respect the idea that there is a huge amount of complexity here. And I want to give you one, this is by no means exhaustive, there are many more models I could have talked about. I'm going to give you one final one, what I call prophetic conflict, which I've extracted from, this is a fantastic book, again with another very downplayed title, Willem Drees's Religion and Science in Context. I think this, for my money, is the most profound exploration of science and religion that I know of at the moment. And there are a lot actually, but this is my favourite one. And he points out that science and religion as a thing, as a field if you like, is a product of secularization. If we didn't live in a secularized world, this activity, conferences like this, wouldn't exist. In other words, it's driven by conflict. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because here we are discussing these amazingly important and fascinating issues. And he wants to say that actually conflict can be a good thing between science and religion if you remember that religion should have a prophetic dimension. In other words, it doesn't just take all of the pushback, it should push back itself against science. So he suggests that if science is all about seeking to understand the way the world is now, religion should, if it's doing its job, point to a better world and offer a critical perspective on science. Religion or theology should, if it's doing its job, be holding science up to account, which means that conflict is inevitable to some degree. A good example of this, I think, is what we've seen over the last 10 years with the new atheism debate, which has particularly fallen onto religion and theology. But actually, I think that the kind of the message that comes from many of the new atheists actually affects all of the humanities. This rhetoric that science provides the ultimate answers, and that all of human knowledge really can be solved by if we apply the scientific method. I think all of the humanities should be reacting to this, not just religion and theology, but the fact that many people from religion and theology have stood up and responded, often in extremely wise and profound ways. You know, it's religion acting in a prophetic way, I think. So I'm coming towards the end now, so I'll give you, this is a kind of summary slide of all of the models I've talked about, and remember, I could have talked about others. Barber's fourfold models nearly always form the starting point for this discussion, so I've just given you Barber and a few others. Conflict, independence, dialogue and integration were Barber's 4 models, and I said that independence and dialogue, there's a certain amount of perhaps overlap and a lacking in content of them, which is why people have also wanted to talk about complementarity, concordance and consonance. I also introduced the idea of complexity here, which tends to be attributed to John Hedley Brooke, and finally prophetic conflict, Wim Drees. But I'd just like to offer you my last one, which I think is not said often enough, namely that there is an awful lot of incomprehension going on in this dialogue. People sounding off about religion who know very little about it, and vice versa about science. So the question in my title, Science and Religion, is this a clash of worldviews? Well, if you followed me this far, I hope you'll agree with me that this is a very complex question with many different possible answers. There are certainly ways in which science can be said to be a worldview. There are ways in which religion can be said to be a worldview. But what I've suggested is that it's more accurate to see one worldview, your own one, informed by science and religion in varying degrees, but also sitting in this kind of social, economic, ethical framework. And to boil it down to one model, one category, clash for instance, I think would really be to avoid the truth of what it means to be a human being. I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
Mark, thank you very much. And there are many speakers who, on being given a title they didn't like, would just sort of forget about the title and just do their own thing. But you've really engaged with it. I'm very grateful, and I think you've done it really well to kick us off. So now, in all our lectures, we allow time for questions. There will be a microphone coming round.
Thank you. You hear me okay? Yeah, my name's Mickey Pallett, just for the name. You spoke about how we get to connect different areas of science, like Hadron Collider and dinosaurs. Is this not just because we don't yet have a theory of everything? And when we have a theory of everything, then those will become connected? or is it that you look upon a deity as a theory of everything?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a very perceptive way of looking at it. Yes, I have effectively offered you a theological theory of everything. That's right. I don't believe that there is a scientific theory of everything, because if that happens, science will stop being science, we'll have solved everything, and we might as well go home. And well, actually, at that point, I think science becomes theology. You get to the integration model of Ian Barber. In my own work, I think we are so far from talking about a theory of everything that is meaningful that it's almost nonsensical to speak of one. Physicists in particle physics who tend to talk about a theory of everything have a very particular view of what that means. Essentially, it's binding the four forces of nature into one theoretical framework. Whether you can then apply that to understand T-Rexes is another question altogether. So that theory, talking of a theory of everything, tends to assume that all of science can be reduced to the basic laws of physics, and that paleontology, chemistry, whatever, are just kind of higher order sciences which one day will disappear because everything will become particle physics. I personally, as a physicist, do not believe that. I'm not a particle physicist, I should add. So that's why at the moment I prefer to offer theological explanations for what binds the sciences together from my perspective.
Okay, just here in the middle.
My question is about the kind of systemicity which arises from any model of interaction between science and religion. It is assumed that science and religion both have a kind of an acceptance of something called laws of nature. But the problem is that, are there really laws of nature? That's one really very interesting problem. And if there are no laws, if I take a kind of a devil's advocate position, then it seems that the boundary between science and religion actually dissolves into a number of insights that arises from both the sides or from some other areas too, especially from ethics and something called spirituality, which may have opened up a different dimension for both science and religion, in the sense that it actually blurs many distinctions based on which modern science has based itself. I would like to hear on this.
Okay, so thank you. Yeah, there was a lot in that question. I'll talk about the laws of nature first, because that's close to my heart. You're absolutely right that we use this phrase, laws of nature, as a throwaway, talking about what is the ultimate aim of science, to describe the laws of nature. And particularly those of us who work in mainstream science and don't read the philosophers are usually unaware of the fact that, at least over the last century or so, there's been a huge amount of discussion in philosophy over what does it mean to talk about a law of nature. Just to put it very simply, is a law of nature something that is descriptive of the world, namely it's just our best attempt to describe a regularity we see, or is it prescriptive, namely the laws of nature exist somewhere, rather like the Platonic universe, in the kind of the highest level, the forms and ideas which everything else reflects. Those are two possible answers to it. Now, speaking as I did of the laws of nature, clearly I didn't pay any attention to all of those questions and ambiguities. But you're absolutely right that once you start to introduce the philosophical and the theological questions behind those basic concepts that scientists throw away all the time, you introduce even more complexities into the issues. And laws of nature, it's a very interesting term that is more often used rhetorically than in terms of any kind of really meaningful scientific empirical content behind it. Spirituality, I'm very glad you raised that too. Just to give you a little anecdote, this was terrific. I was invited to a conference at CERN last year to discuss with some particle physicists all about, what's the ultimate meaning of what they were doing, what I'm doing. And quite a number of scientists there wanted to talk about spirituality. And they said, I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic, but nevertheless, it doesn't seem to be meaningful to me to do this without reflecting on the spirituality of science. And coming out of the last 10 years of the new atheism, I was very encouraged by that, actually. So I'll just stop there. I hope I've managed to capture some of what you were asking.
Right at the back there.
Hi, I'm Andy Fletcher. Seems like an area of ongoing conflict between science and religion is the question of free will. I have one article in my files that says that fruit flies have free will, and another one says that humans do not. And so science goes back and forth on it. Philosophers go back and forth on it, but theology, particularly Christian, Jewish, and as far as I know, Islamic theology, are all pretty much focused on free will being an operative part of the way things go.
Yeah, thank you. Another great question. Gosh, how much time do I have?
Plenty of time.
Yeah, okay,
There's
good.
plenty of time till coffee.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Give it your
so
full...
free will. So as you're probably aware, this has been, the issue of whether humans have free will or not has been debated in philosophical circles since about the 18th century. It's this called the compatibilist-incompatibilist debate. The idea being that particularly in the sort of Newtonian worldview with laws of nature which determine the behavior of every particle in the universe, if that is true, then how can we possibly be said to have free will? Surely it's just an illusion or an epiphenomenon, as is often said. It just appears to us that we have free will, but actually, if you could describe the position and the speed of every particle in our brains, you'd be able to predict what we were going to think. Yeah, that's, I mean, I've caricatured it, but that's the most extremely reductionistic viewpoint. I think what the free will debate captures, so this has been an issue for hundreds of years. It's come back again, in particular, because of a great deal of research being done in the neurosciences at the moment, which tends to assume that all of our mental processes can be traced back to something biological in our brains, and then on to the properties of electrons, basically. So that would suggest that our consciousness can be, if you can tie it down to the behavior of electrons, we don't have free will. The trouble is, though, that that's the main consensus at the moment in the neurosciences and cognitive science. We don't have any way of testing that. So it's an assumption, but at the moment we don't have any way of testing it because consciousness cannot be understood at the moment from a scientific perspective. You can observe someone experiencing consciousness in an MRI scanner, but that doesn't mean that you then understand it. So I think that this question is going to run and run for quite a long time. What it often is related to is the question of whether humans have a soul or not, which people from a religious perspective often get very, very heated about. In Edinburgh, at our master's programme, we always have a session on the soul, and this is always the one that creates the most heated debates amongst the students and me, particularly when I tell them, just to try to kind of set the cat amongst pigeons, I say, I don't believe in the soul. For many of them, they think I've just committed utter heresy. So it's all very, very interesting. We can talk about all kinds of other things, very, very contentious things, but the question of whether humans have a soul or not and whether science can demonstrate that is often the one that creates the greatest sound and light, heat anyway.
Okay, just come forward a little bit there.
Quickly, you mentioned that Teilhard de Chardin and intelligent design have something in common, and I was curious.
I didn't capture the first.
You mentioned that Teilhard de Chardin and intelligent design, I believe, both fit into the integration model. Was that the?
Well, you could say that they fit into it. Yes.
So I just like to hear.
Agree with me.
My question is, since Chardin, as a sort of proponent of this Catholic understanding that natural mechanisms are perfectly within the domain of a Christian God, whereas at least the sort of Protestant-based intelligent design advocates tend to disagree with that. Can you justify that a bit more? I mean, what does Teilhard de really have to do with intelligent design?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking me to clarify that. I didn't mean to suggest for a moment that Teilhard is in any way associated with intelligent design. For one thing, he died in the 1950s. Intelligent design didn't really get going until the 1990s. If you could see any links, it would be perhaps with that venerable tradition of natural theology and the argument from design. But as far as I know, he didn't write on that. what I was trying to say instead was that both intelligent design and Théodore Chardin can be seen as examples of movements or scientists trying to incorporate theology into their work so closely that they're doing, and theologians trying to incorporate science, so closely that one is almost doing the work of the other. That's what I was trying to suggest, without for a moment saying they're the same thing or linked at all closely.
Mark, I wonder if for the benefit of anybody here who doesn't quite know what you mean by intelligent design, you mean sort of capital I, capital D, the movement. Could you just unpack that a little bit?
So
Thank you.
this is a movement that particularly began in the United States but has spread elsewhere, which is I mean, Dennis might be able to explain this better than I because I think he's written on it. I haven't. But I'll have a go anyway. So there are particular names, Philip Johnson, William Dembski, Michael Behe, who have suggested that, particularly when you look at life, the evolutionary explanation for life, there are problems, scientific problems in the evolutionary perspective that are so difficult that we will never be able to explain them. And that is because we need to call upon this being, the intelligent designer, capital I, capital D. Now, depending on who you read in intelligent design, they may equate that intelligent designer with God. Other intelligent design proponents prefer not to speak of God, but try to say, well, we're talking about science. There's a scientific hypothesis. So Michael Behe, in his book, Darwin's Black Box, talks about how, after having gone through several examples from molecular biology and cell biology, he suggests that what we have discovered is something as important as the works of Lavoisier and Einstein and so on. We've discovered that there really is evidence of design in the cell. And this is so important, it's like a first-rank scientific discovery is his suggestion. And then he would go on to claim for the existence of the intelligent designer and to say that he was doing science, not theology. Now, as you can probably imagine, this has created a huge backlash from mainstream scientists. And I'll stop there, actually. Dennis, would you like to say anything? Because no? Okay. I'm just aware that there are other experts in the room as well, and I don't want to shoot my mouth off.
And of course, one of the problems with ID is that as soon as the science comes up with an explanation for whatever this complex problem was, then it reduces the space for this intelligent designer. It's essentially a God of the gaps kind of an argument, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that as well. Are people familiar with the God of the gaps problem? Maybe some. I'll just for those of you who aren't, as Hilary said, it's a problem that is a particular issue for intelligent design. That if you say and say, we can't find any science that explains this, so therefore we will call upon intelligent supernatural being to explain it. What happens when God gets squeezed out of the gap? And so that's why tend to be very good at identifying God of the gaps problems. Intelligent design is often said to be to fall foul of the God.
I wondered if you could say something about nature of religion, sort of addressing issues in science and calling science to something. I wonder if you could just say something about what you think the key areas that religion should be kind of speaking to science or in conversation with science or calling science forward to.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the main area that religion, theology can call science to account in is in which science gets a bit beyond itself, rhetorically speaking. And I would say that the new atheist discourse is one of the best examples of science getting too big for its boots in a way, making claims about knowledge and what it means to be a human being, which simply aren't warranted by where the science is at the moment. Particularly, I mean, of course, we talk about science as though it's one thing, and I try to make the point that it's very, very difficult to work out how to join them up as one enterprise. So I think that religion and theology can make a very important contribution to the debate by holding science up to account and saying, look, you know, what do you mean when you say that science tells us this, science proves that? How can you prove that? How can you tell us that human beings don't have a soul, for instance? There is another perspective on this. So, yeah, particularly to do with foundational issues of science, I think, not necessarily interpretation of experiments or whatever, but certainly the foundational issues of how do we appropriate this material as human beings, and what does it mean to us in our lives? I think science needs an awful lot of interpreting from a philosophical and theological perspective.